Thank you very much for joining us for today's second in our series of credibility in neuroimaging webinars organised by the British Neuroscience Association. And we're really pleased today to have Cyril Pernet with us, who is a senior research software developer at the Neurobiology Research Unit in Copenhagen University Hospital. Cyril is also the data protection officer who's tasked with monitoring compliance in GDPR and other data protection laws and policies. So Cyril is incredibly experienced as an imager and also in terms of compliance and governance around data. So Cyril will be speaking to us today for around 20 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for Q&A. And if you want to stay on after our scheduled finish time, you're welcome to. We'll continue the Q&A there. So please use the Q&A box for your questions, and Verena and Joe at BNA will be posting essential information in the chat as well. So have a look at the chat. And so I'll hand over now. My name is Cassandra Gould van Praag. By the way, my pronouns are she, her. And I'm the Open Science Community Engagement Coordinator at the Wellcome Imaging Centre at the University of Oxford. So please take it away with your slides, Cyril, and look forward to joining you for discussion at the end.
All right, thank you. Thank you. And thank you, the BNA, for the invitation. So let's go. Okay, so as Cassandra was saying today, I will introduce various maybe solutions on how to share data and the issues around data privacy. The talk also is not only recorded, but you can also find it on Figshare if you want to download the slides, and it's in the chat. Quick background. As Cassandra was saying, I'm a neuroimager. I'm actually a neuropsychologist by training. Done a lot of open science, being data computation, so on, some neuroinformatics, and my research in human brain imaging also related to clinical application. So at the end of the day, what I want to be able to do is to share some data and to collaborate with people. But we are in Europe and you are in UK, and UK is also GDPR, UK GDPR. And so what can we do? That's basically what I want to address today. And so what I'm not discussing are alternative models. For instance, you could have a consortia like Enigma, where you share derivative data, or you can have distributed analysis, where the analysis only run on your own server using, for instance, CoinStack. So I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about the kind of usual things. Here, a bunch of data that I want to share, how I do that. So what type of data are we talking about? I will just go through the different types in terms of neuroimaging and how I match it in terms of privacy and what the law says. And so maybe you've seen this similar kind of picture adapted from Ross Polrak and Chris Kolgoleski about the potential reuse of data. And so the less useful, still useful, are group level summary data, where we share peak coordinates, right, in articles, but also min maps, say, on Neurovolt. Then a little bit more useful, maybe for the usage, is the subject level summary data, if we want to aggregate across multiple studies. So we can use the maps, but also ROI value, time activity curves, things like this. Of course, what we want really ultimately is to be able to share the raw data, of course, curated using beads. They are not curated, they are not that useful. And of course, we can also share the raw data, possibly with clinical information and also some data processing. Now, if we look at what the law says, and you also probably heard about what is pseudonymization or pseudo-anonymization. Under GDPR, there's only two types of data. Either the data are personal or they are anonymous, and that's it. There's no such a thing as pseudonymized data. Pseudo-anonymization under GDPR is just a process which reduces the risk of identification. What it means you can pseudonymize data and they remain personal data. Basically, what their identification must be is to be completely irreversible to then consider data as anonymous. I here a little point as well, even if your data are completely anonymous, because we do brain imaging, imagine you have a patient which is the same single patient in the whole of the country having this kind of disorder. You publish about it and you share your data. Well, clearly, it's relatively easy to single out who it is. So even completely anonymized cannot be that anonymous. Anyway, back to that pyramid. What we can see is that really the only type of anonymous data are these group level and summary data. Anything else, I would argue, are personal data. And then you will say, oh, okay, but then if everything else is personal data, how do I share this? And before we get there, I also want to point a couple of things that you need to really think about in terms of what is anonymous and what's not. So after you remove the ID, obviously, can you still single out people? Is it possible to link with any record? And can the information be inferred regarding individuals? And these are also important to consider. This is one of the articles of GDPR that says basically you have to focus on concrete means to anonymize or pseudonymize, but also consider the costs and also assess the likelihood. So it's not just like black or white, there is a little bit of freedom here in what you would consider anonymous or not. So the most obvious things to think about is linkage. And most often in neuroimaging, what we do is we keep a key to reverse the ID, right? So it means we have our subject 001, we removed all the DICOM tags, we use Nifty, everything seems to be anonymous, but we kept a key. And so even if brain imaging would be anonymous data, the simple fact that you keep a key to find the name of that person, to contact that person if needed, this makes it not anonymous data. And if you think about concrete means, if you share clinical data, so in that paper by Luc Rocher, they don't use neuroimaging. We're talking about just sharing a lot of metadata, clinical metadata. And by having something very simple in terms of modeling, using Gaussian copula, mixing up with some census data, you know, Julia, Python, good stat data science knowledge, you can reconstruct with a likelihood of 90%, 95% identify people. So the risk is very high. Now, I'm going to quickly go through a bunch of neuroimaging things before moving on, because I'm sure you've seen this before. If you say, well, I've shared only T1, T2, and I deface my data, well, with machine learning using GANs, also more recently using CNN, we can reconstruct faces. So if we take, like, for instance, the most right, this is a classical SPM. I remove completely a zero out part of the face, well, it can still reconstruct it. And the accuracy is pretty good. And so it's probably not a good solution. And it is not a good solution also because now people have shown that if you remove facial feature, you will degrade the performance of image analysis, registration can fail, the structural brain measures can change as well, and defacing also bias your QA. So probably, even if it would be the case that we can share these defaced, it's probably not a good idea. If you think, I do PET, I don't care, well, PET, you can also reconstruct brain images, faces with that, without the T1. Now you're saying, okay, well, maybe I can share something else, like matrices for connectivity or things like this. But again, using Febuary, and actually was even some of the tests that they've done was not on the images themselves, but on the connectivity matrices, and you can still access and identify or single out individuals. And then you're like, okay, well, I don't do this, I do MEG, I'm fine. No, you're not either. There's a bunch of papers which show that electrophysiology has a very good discriminability, it's very stable over time, and it's tightly coupled with molecular expression and gene expression. So in the, for instance, in the this paper in HPM, this is with twins, which have unique mutations, and then they can identify pairs of twins based on the molecular expression and how it correlates with spectral power. So all that to say that realistically, sure, some things are difficult. For instance, refacing using GANs and CNN because the training is difficult. But nowadays, it's becoming incredibly easy to use these tools. Simply the face matching in itself, right, is really easy. You've got a lot of tools. You can just read the documentation and say, can I do a face matching, match with Facebook data? And for instance, in Schwartz et al. Paper 2 years ago, they show that they can re-identify people from matching T1 reconstructed faces with photos, 80–90% accuracy. Now, if you think re-identifications from complex data set, for instance, from the human brain HPC data set, again, people were able to re-identify or single out individuals about 90%. All this to say that realistically, brain imaging data cannot be safely considered as anonymous. It doesn't matter what we do, whether we deface, whether we remove any kind of ID, still the risk is very high. Therefore, it's easier to consider them as personal and then to move forward with protection. And so in this case, what you should do, and what, GDPR and UK GDPR is just the same as GDPR. So what should you do? So we consider, right, that we can re-identify directly or indirectly. So we are right into UK GDPR and EU GDPR. Anything else, just as a side, if it's animal studies, if all your subjects are dead, if it's anonymous tissue, this doesn't concern GDPR, right? If you have data from dead people, it's fine, you can share it, you can even do what you want with it. GDPR doesn't care. And also, anything with no ID and no way to go back to the ID is something that really matters. Now, in terms of data protection, we can also think, okay, so now what can I do? Typically, people would say, well, I cannot share personal data. Well, this is not true. Right at the beginning of GDPR Article 5, you've got something that says the right to the protection of personal data is not an absolute right. And what does it mean? So let's say what I'm thinking about here is you're scanning somebody, you got an algorithm, which is about 1.8% of incidental findings. You don't need to take any precaution to share that file because the principle of proportionality tells you, okay, this is really important that that person is seen right away. You don't care within the hospital who's going to see this file. You want to get it done and transfer it quickly. And that's fine. Now you could say, okay, but now I'm not talking about incidental finding. I'm talking about my healthy subject where everything is good. And so what I do need is lab-to-lab agreement. And then it means we need to involve lawyers and stuff like this, which is extremely complicated. That's what we tend to do, but really it's a myth. We don't need to do that either. Because again, right at the beginning of GDPR Article 5, it tells you there is a free movement of personal data, at least within the union, which is not restricted. So if I want to share between labs, at least within the European Union, we don't need much of an agreement, because this is just something that they assume we would do. So sharing within the EU and even extended countries, which is defined as safe country, is permitted. All you need is a simple data user agreement. Then you will say, okay, so now I can share, but I've seen that in GDPR, we can only reuse the data for what the study was designed for. So I was doing a study on memory, therefore you can only do memory business. Well, this is not true even. Again, it is written right at the beginning, often not possible to fully identify the purpose of personal data processing for scientific research. Yes, GDPR has something for us scientists because they know that this is different from, sharing your data for business. There's even some add-on in recital 50, which says you need to reuse if compatible with initial consent, but also in recital 33 tells you you don't need to be specific. So you would say, hey, do you want to share the data that will be used for biomedical research? And that is good enough. So how you do it concretely? Well, you go to these websites. And what we have in there is templates to help you to do this. So what you need is your consent to participate to a study, which you already do. And that's an ethic question. That's not what I'm talking about here. What you need to do is to create a second consent. And that consent is the consent to share the data. And this has to receive institutional approval because, of course, you depend on your institution, your university, or your hospital. So you need to check with your sponsor. You don't need to check with your ethics committee. The ethics committee is there to check that what you're doing in terms of research is lawful, not how you share your data. So this is just institution. So if you go on the open brain consent, you will see there is a special section for GDPR. And basically what really matters in that consent is that it's the same thing as when you inform your patient or your participant about the study, right? You explain what the study is about, you explain the consequences and so on. And it's the same when you share the data. You must not just get consent to share, but also explain how it will be shared, with possibly with whom, under which condition, and so on. And I really, really recommend to split the two things. One is your ethics committee, this is how I'm going to do the study. One is your institution that says, yes, you can share, and this is the consent that you obtain to do it. Because these are completely separate issues, really. Something related to GDPR would be to say, and the sharing would be to say, okay, but now I've got my data, I have to be open access to be fair. Again, this is a myth. Fair, at least the beginning, right? Findable, accessible. Means you must be in an indexed repository, your university library, eBrains, for instance. So which means index, it means it's searchable. If it's searchable and it has keywords, it means it's findable, right? And accessible. So the data can be fair. So open access can make things easier, but it doesn't have to do. And control access is fine too, if we can find and search, right? And we need control access under GDPR because you need people to sign the data user agreement. You need to know who's using the data. And so just to finish, now it means you need an infrastructure to share and to be fair. Sharing personal identifiable data means that you need the consent to share, but you need the infrastructure, right? And an infrastructure which allows access control to identify the users using a legal agreement, and also, for instance, signing the DOA. And if it's non-EU people, it's more complicated. You need to sign what's called standard contractual clause. But I will not get into those details. Now, it means you need to identify if that's possible early on, because you're going to say, well, I'm going to have a consent to share. So I want to tell people where I'm going to do this. And so it means you need to check with your institution, typically your library, if that's something that is possible, that is planned. Somehow, this is really the job of your institution to provide an infrastructure. I know they don't, but really it's their job, not yours. And then I would finish by consider also alternatives. Two of them. One is the eBrains, which is the health data cloud, which is very useful for working on what's called data lake. So then you need to also do the computation online. And there's also a repository linked to the Open Neuroped project, which, as the name you suspect, works with WASPODRAC and Open Neuro, where we will soon opening the platform that we call Public Neuro. And please, if you are interested in trying it, we will open soon-ish. Please get in touch, and we can probably help you to share your data using these approaches. All right, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cyril. I really appreciate the depth but brevity of the information that you've presented. I know there's a lot we can talk about. So please, there's one question in the Q&A, so please do get some more questions in there if you have any. And while folks are thinking, I'll take the opportunity to put in some of my questions. So at the WIN, the centre I work at, we're doing that job of developing what we're calling a data portal. And a couple of the points that we're getting caught up at are the conversations that need to happen between ethics and contracts or the legal team. And so, for example, ethics say, yes, the information that you've provided to your participants is acceptable. And then contracts say, well, what do you have ethical approval for? And they want different degrees of information, or different levels of information. And we find ourselves constantly moving between these parties and not getting anyone to agree on something that we can like practically implement. Do you have any advice for kind of managing those conversations, or any tactics we could try?
Well, the tactic that seems to work is to convince the ethics committees that their role is to do ethics, to manage how you share your data, which is, you know, Helsinki, not type. So there's two declarations actually from the World Health Organization, right? You've got the Helsinki, which tells you this is how you need to do medical research, and, you know, you need to inform your patient and blah, 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 all of this stuff. There's another one, which is the Taipei, which has to do with data, which was mostly at the beginning designed for genomics. And clearly these are two separate things. So now the ethics committee somehow, some of them, not all ethics committees. So for instance, where I am, the ethics committee was like, hey, data sharing stuff was got to do with how you do ethically, or you ethically conduct a study. That's not what an ethics committee is there for. Or they take a new job on, which is how to ethically share. But that's probably not in the remit of your ethics committee. Because so far, every ethics committee I've seen, their remit doesn't include that. They suddenly decided, hey, we're going to decide on that. And you're like, well, what's your expertise to decide on that? Oh, well, actually, we don't have any. Okay, thank you very much for your advices, but maybe not. And so really, I think it's much better to, if possible, right? But if not, then you need to discuss with them, okay, but what does, not Helsinki, because this is not what we're doing the data sharing, and this is Taipei. And that's why also I really recommend to use two separate consent forms. Instead of bundling into the same consent form, this is the form to participate to the study and also to share the data. I said, this is how we're going to conduct the study. And it's got nothing to do on how we're going to share the data. You could very well say, I want to participate to a study, but I don't want my data to be shared. Which, of course, for people like you and me, were like, oh, not so good for reproducibility. But that's a separate issue, right?
Yeah.
At least you can get on with saying, well, I can reproduce almost with 99% of subjects, because two of them didn't want to share. But
better than nothing, right? That's better than nothing. Yeah.
And also you really separate those as two separate issues. It really helps to actually really separate those. Because the lawyers, they don't, because from the GDPR perspective, from the law wants simply something that says, do I have a record that people are okay to share their data? That's all the law wants to, that's all they want. That's why you can go online on a website and they say, do you accept the cookies? Do you accept the blah, blah, blah? You know, we constantly click and accept shit. Because that's what the law says. But you don't go for an ethics committee for that, do you? So why should we?
Great. That's great. Thank you. I can imagine myself saying that to the ethics committee, that maybe that's one for my senior
pointing out
managers.
as well the difference between Taipei and Helsinki, and
yes.
look at their remit, right? Because somewhere when the ethics committee has been constituted, they have a remit. And then most likely pointing out, but it's not in your remit. So why really are we discussing it?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. So we've got a few questions coming in. So the first question is about, we're talking about data sharing in terms of GDPR, and that affects a lot of us. What about data sharing with collaborators in the US and Canada?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning, for US and Canada, actually the only, well, it's not the only thing, but one thing that you need, that question disappeared because I'm answering it. is to have the standard contractual clause that needs to be signed. So you do need extra paperwork. So in any case, you need paperwork, right? A little bit of paperwork, which is a signed data use agreement. So in the open grade consent, we have an example of template of what you would, so that acts in Europe as you would say a license. So instead of having a license attached to it, you have a data use agreement, which means people who don't know agree and sign that this is in the context they will use it. Now, you also need the standard contractual clause because, like US, Canada, they are not considered safe country. Surprise, surprise. And so basically, you have some extra documentation that needs to be signed with not just US, Canada, every country which is not considered safe country. So right now we have EU plus 13 countries. It was 12, but recently they accepted South Korea. So 13 countries, including some countries you wouldn't expect, but it's on the EU website and you can see. Assuming that UK GDPR is going to align with GDPR in terms of which country is included or not, but it might not be at the same pace, right? So EU just accepted South Korea. Does UK already accepted it as well? I don't know.
Right.
That's tricky.
And then relatedly, someone has mentioned agreements I wasn't aware that there are specific agreements on OSF, but it sounds like that, is there, I wasn't aware that there's a facility to sign anything when you share data via OSF. I know you can make reviewer links, but
maybe Chris can specify what it means, because there's no agreement when you put data on OSF, unless if you put an agreement on OSF, but then nobody can check that it's signed. Maybe Chris can elaborate a bit.
Great. Thank you.
I can answer the question. Yes, I can see them. So
great, thank you.
Okay, next is Rick. Hi, Rick. Yeah, what do you do if it retracts? Okay, so that's the same. In the consent form, not about the participation, but the consent form to share, there should also be something about that. So you could, and it's up to you, right? Because you ask people to sign the consent form. So you could have a consent form that says, there's no way you can retract your data when it's shared. And then people decide to sign or not. Typically, what we propose is to say, if you later want to retract, we will remove your data set from our repository, but we cannot chase every single copy. So we need to understand what it means to put your data on the web, and people don't know it then, right? That's all there is. It's like when you participate to a study, it's about the information. So you need to give enough information, such as, well, if there is 100 people who downloaded your data set, that's going to be very hard for us to go and check in each of those institutions that your data has been removed. And we won't be doing that anyway. What we'll do is remove only from ours, and that's all we can do. And then people decide to sign, and that's why you want to separate the two signing, right? The study and the consent. Because really, I think that as it will go, some will just say, fine to do a study, but I don't want my data on the web. And, it's up to us to deal with our producibility, but it should not be on the shoulder of participants.
And great. And then in the last official minute, perhaps we'll move to Vittorio's question. While Cyril's digesting that question, I'd like to just thank you, everyone who's been able to join us today. This talk was recorded, and the previous one in the series from last week, they'll both be available on YouTube. And then we've got a final session around research data management coming up towards the end of February. So thank you. If anyone needs to leave the call now as we're on time, you're very welcome to leave, and thank you for coming. And anyone that'd like to stay on for a little bit further discussion, you're very welcome to stay as well.